What if the fate of empires was not decided in royal palaces or great battlefields, but on distant seas, in slave ports, and in forgotten missions at the edge of the world? In our first chapter of Echoes of Time, we witnessed the last Ming emperor take his life as rebels stormed Beijing, the treachery of Shanhai Pass, the famine that hollowed out villages, the comet that blazed across the heavens, and the thunder of Marston Moor and Freiburg. In the second, we marched through England's civil war at Cheriton, York, Lostwithiel, and Newbury. We stepped into the terror of Matthew Hopkins, the defiance of Roger Williams, the election of a new pope, and the immortal voice of John Milton. At the end of that episode, I left you with two riddles. The first spoke of fire upon the northern seas. That was the Battle of Kolberger Heide, when the Danish and Swedish fleets clashed off Schleswig's coast in July 1644. A brutal fight where both kings commanded in person, and neither side could claim victory. The second spoke of a princess whose palace burned in India. That was Jahanara Begum, daughter of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, who survived the fire and spent her vast wealth rebuilding not only her own halls, but also funding hospitals and aid for the poor of Delhi. Two very different moments, both echoing the fragility of life in 1644. Now we widen the stage. This chapter reveals how 1644 unfolded far from Europe's capitals. We will see a Maltese raid spark a Mediterranean war, Dutch Brazil shaken by rebellion, the slave ports of Angola bleeding humanity into the Atlantic, and Spain's silver lifeline faltering. We will witness Jesuit triumphs in China and their expulsion from Ethiopia, and hear the first shots of rivalry between the Dutch and English in Asia. Stay with us for this global journey. Like this story, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and if you wish to keep history alive, consider a small donation to our channel. In the summer of 1644, the waters of the eastern Mediterranean boiled with violence. On the 30th of September, a squadron of ships under the flag of the Knights of Malta fell upon an Ottoman convoy near Crete. The target was no ordinary fleet. It carried hundreds of Muslim pilgrims bound for Mecca and rich treasure collected across the empire. The attack was swift and merciless. Cannons roared and grappling hooks clanged against timbers as the Maltese knights boarded. The battle raged for hours before the Ottomans were overwhelmed. More than 300 pilgrims were killed, and many survivors were carried off as captives. Among the dead was the governor of Cairo. Among the spoils was a fortune in coin, silk, and spices. The knights returned to Malta in triumph, parading their loot and prisoners through the narrow streets of Valletta. To them, it was another victory in their holy war against the Crescent. But to the Ottomans, it was an outrage that could not go unanswered. News of the massacre reached Sultan Ibrahim in Constantinople. The fury of his court was described by Venetian envoys. The sea is aflame, and with it the empire's wrath. The Sultan demanded vengeance. The target of his anger, however, was not only Malta, but also the Republic of Venice, suspected of collusion. Venice controlled Crete, whose waters had witnessed the raid, and the Ottomans seized the chance to strike. Thus began the Cretan War, a conflict that would last 24 years. It was one of the longest wars in Mediterranean history, fought over islands and sea lanes, dragging in mercenaries, corsairs, and fleets from across Europe. In 1644, the spark was small, a single raid. Yet it unleashed a struggle that would bleed Venice and the Ottomans alike, reshaping power in the Aegean. For the people of Crete, the war that followed was devastation. Villages burned, crops withered under sieges, and entire generations were lost. But in 1644, all this still lay ahead. In that moment, as the Knights of Malta counted their spoils and the Sultan swore revenge, Europe and the Levant braced for another cycle of endless war. The raid also revealed a deeper truth of the 17th century. Empires were not only broken by dynasties falling in their palaces or armies clashing on land. They were also broken by the sea, by commerce, and by raids that could erupt into wars lasting decades. A convoy attacked near Crete became the spark for a Mediterranean struggle that outlived many of the men who had fired its first shots. Far across the Atlantic, in the sugar-rich lands of Brazil, another turning point of 1644 unfolded. For 2 decades, the Dutch had fought to carve out a colonial empire in the Americas, seizing territories from Portugal and Spain. At the center of their experiment stood a single man, Johan Maurits of Nassau-Siegen, governor of Dutch Brazil. Johan Maurits was no ordinary colonial administrator. He was a soldier, scholar, and patron of the arts. Arriving in Recife in 1637, he transformed the colony into something unique in the New World. He encouraged religious tolerance, allowing Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and even free Africans to practice their faith openly. He invited scientists and artists to document the landscapes, the flora, and the people of Brazil. Under his watch, cartographers mapped rivers, naturalists collected specimens, and painters like Franz Post sketched the sugar plantations and native villages. To the Dutch West India Company, however, these accomplishments mattered less than profit. War in Europe drained resources, and shareholders demanded more sugar and less science. By 1644, whispers of Johan Maurits' extravagance reached Amsterdam. Though he had secured alliances with local tribes and kept Portuguese rebels at bay, his vision of a tolerant and enlightened colony seemed too costly. In May, the company recalled him to Europe. The recall shocked Brazil. Portuguese settlers who had tolerated Dutch rule largely because of Maurits's fairness now bristled under stricter Dutch officials. His departure cracked the fragile balance. Resentment grew, conspiracy spread, and rebellion stirred. Within years, the Portuguese would rise in arms, driving the Dutch from much of Brazil. Contemporaries felt the loss at once. A chronicler wrote, "Without him, the land trembles." Another noted that the governor had made friends among enemies, and now they prepare for war in his absence. Johan Maurits sailed home, his legacy caught between triumph and failure. In Europe, he was celebrated as a cultured prince, later nicknamed the Brazilian. He built palaces, collected art, and displayed maps of the lands he had ruled. Yet the colony he left behind slid toward collapse. His recall in 1644 was more than a personal setback. It marked the beginning of the end for Dutch Brazil. The brief dream of a multi-faith scientific colony in the tropics gave way to rebellion, war, and eventual Portuguese victory. The Dutch shifted their ambitions toward Asia, where spices promised greater riches and fewer settlers to resist. Still, Johan Maurits' years in Brazil left a legacy. His scientist records became some of the earliest detailed studies of South American nature. His painters' canvases carried images of the New World back to Europe, and his experiment in tolerance foreshadowed ideas that would only flourish centuries later. 44 was the year that vision ended. A single recall order from Amsterdam, written in ink, unraveled the colony's fragile peace. Brazil would never see his like again. While Europe bled and Brazil shifted under colonial hands, the coast of Africa bore the heaviest burden of 1644. In the port of Luanda, Angola, the transatlantic slave trade reached one of its cruel peaks. Portuguese captains and local intermediaries loaded ships bound for Brazil, carrying with them not goods but human lives. Records from the mid-17th century show staggering numbers. In 1644 alone, it is estimated that more than 15,000 enslaved men, women, and children were shipped from Angola across the Atlantic. Chained in the holds of ships, they endured weeks of suffocating heat, disease, and terror. Survivors would be sold to labor in Brazil's sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured not in years but in harvests. Jesuit missionaries in Angola wrote letters home describing the scenes. One lamented, "The people are hunted as beasts, driven to the coast in chains and bartered for cloth and weapons." Yet these voices of protest were faint against the roar of profit. Sugar demanded labor, and Europe's appetite was insatiable. For every ship that carried silver or spice, others carried shackled bodies. Luanda itself grew rich. Portuguese merchants built grand houses with courtyards shaded by palm trees. Churches rose on the hills overlooking the harbor, where bells tolled even as captives wept in the pens below. To the colonial elite, it was a city of triumph. To the enslaved, it was a gate of no return. The cruelty was not faceless. Accounts tell of children torn from mothers, of men branded with hot irons before boarding. Some captives threw themselves into the sea rather than face the journey. Others clung to fragments of hope, carrying songs and stories that would echo in distant lands. Weaving African memory into the fabric of the Americas reminds us that global history was not only battles of kings or shifts of dynasties. It was also the silent suffering of thousands whose names never reached the chronicles. Their forced labor fed the sugar consumed in London, Lisbon, and Amsterdam. Their lives financed the wars fought in Europe. The famine in China left peasants starving. But in Angola, human bodies themselves became currency. The trade that passed through Luanda was not only an exchange of goods, but of souls, uprooted from their homes and scattered across the ocean. This was the hidden engine of the 17th century. While parliaments debated liberty and emperors proclaimed their divine right, the decks of ships from Luanda carried the cost. 1644 was another year when the Atlantic groaned with chains. In 1644, even the mightiest empire of Europe trembled not from a single battle, but from the silence of its treasure fleets. For over a century, the wealth of Spain had poured from the mines of the Americas, carried across the Atlantic in galleons heavy with silver. That river of metal fed the armies of the Habsburgs, the splendor of Madrid, and the ambitions of kings. But by the mid-17th century, the river was running dry. Reports from Seville that year spoke with dread. The treasure fleets that had once arrived in glittering convoys slowed to a trickle. Pirates prowled the Caribbean. Storms swallowed ships, and most crucially, the mines themselves faltered. In Potosi, the mountain of silver that had sustained Spain's power for generations, production was collapsing. Mercury needed for refining grew scarce, and laborers, many of them Andean men forced into service, fled or perished under the brutal draft known as the Mita. By 1644, Spain's imports of silver had fallen to their lowest levels in decades. Chroniclers in Madrid wrote of empty coffers and soldiers unpaid. The mines are silent, one official lamented, and with them the king's coffers. The consequences spread far beyond the palace walls. Inflation raged, coins were debased, and merchants complained that trade with Asia and Europe faltered without the silver to grease its wheels. The irony was cruel. While Spain had once drowned in silver, it now drowned in debt. Wars in the Netherlands, Italy, and Germany demanded endless coin. Yet the silver that had made the empire feared now exposed its fragility. The decline of shipments in 1644 was not just an economic setback, but a symbol of a golden century dimming into twilight. For ordinary Spaniards, the crisis was visible in daily life. Prices rose while wages stagnated. Riots broke out in Andalusia as bread grew scarce. Some muttered that God was punishing Spain for its pride, for the endless wars fought in his name. Others whispered darker rumors, that ministers had stolen the treasure or that foreign devils had cursed the fleets. The truth was harsher. The empire's wealth had always rested on the backs of others. Indigenous miners in Peru, enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, sailors risking storms, and corsairs. When those supports crumbled, the empire's foundation shook. In 1644, Spain remained a grand power in name, but its financial heart was weakening. The collapse of silver imports foreshadowed a century of decline, when France, England, and the Dutch would rise to eclipse the once mighty Habsburgs. The glitter of bullion had built an empire, but it could not preserve it. And so, while battles raged in England and famine swept China, another kind of war was being lost silently in Spain, the war of finance, of commerce, of numbers written in ledgers. In 1644, the sound of history was not always cannon fire. Sometimes it was the absence of clinking silver in a royal chest. Far from Madrid's empty coffers, another struggle played out on the shores of the Indian Ocean. In 1644, the city of Goa, jewel of the Portuguese Empire in Asia, found itself divided not by invading armies but by conflict between colonists and the very priests meant to guide their souls. Goa had long been a crossroads of trade and belief. Merchants from Gujarat and the Deccan rubbed shoulders with Portuguese settlers, African soldiers, and Jesuit missionaries who dreamed of converting Asia. At the heart of the city stood massive churches and colleges built by the Society of Jesus, whose influence often rivaled that of the crown itself. The Jesuits owned plantations, controlled schools, and wielded great sway over the Inquisition that judged questions of faith. But by 1644, resentment had grown. Portuguese settlers, many of them soldiers and traders who had carved out land through conquest, complained that the Jesuits held too much power. Farmers grumbled that church estates swallowed fertile fields. Merchants accused the order of meddling in commerce, seizing lands and tenants for their missions. A rumor circulated that one settler, forced from his property, muttered bitterly, "The cross weighs heavier than the crown." At the same time, tensions flared between Jesuits and other clergy. Franciscans and Dominicans accused them of arrogance, while colonial officials in Lisbon worried that Jesuit wealth weakened royal authority. The governor of Goa struggled to mediate, but beneath the city's whitewashed facades, quarrels simmered like fire in dry brush. Jesuit letters from this period defend their role fiercely. One missionary wrote, "Without us, the Indians would walk in darkness. With us, the faith shines." Yet critics argued that their focus on land and influence betrayed their vows. For ordinary Goans, Hindus, Muslims, and converted Christians alike, the struggle meant new taxes, stricter rules, and the constant shadow of the Inquisition. The conflict did not erupt into open revolt in 1644, but it foreshadowed the decline of Portuguese supremacy in Asia. Once dominant on the coasts of India, the Portuguese found themselves challenged by the Dutch at sea and resented by their own settlers on land. Goa remained a glittering city, its streets alive with music, markets, and processions, but its foundations were cracking. The story of Goa in 1644 reminds us that empires are not only threatened from without, they can also unravel from within, when faith becomes entangled with ambition and when colonists turn against the very institutions meant to bind them together. While Goa simmered with disputes between settlers and priests, the seas farther east echoed with the thunder of cannon. In 1644, Dutch and English ships clashed in the waters around Java and Ambon, islands whose nutmeg and cloves were worth more than gold in the markets of Europe. These were not great set-piece battles with thousands of men, but smaller engagements, sudden attacks, ambushes at sea, brief but brutal encounters that left wrecks smoldering on the tide. Yet they carried consequences far beyond the horizon. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, had established near total control over the Spice Islands. Their forts ringed Ambon, Banda, and the Moluccas. They guarded these with fierce exclusivity, determined to deny all rivals access. The English East India Company, weaker in numbers but desperate for a foothold, refused to accept exclusion. Letters sent home that year tell of frustration. "The Hollanders deny us trade, and in blood they prove it," one English factor wrote bitterly. In 1644, tensions spilled over when Dutch patrols seized English merchantmen accused of smuggling spices. Some crews were imprisoned, others driven away under fire. Skirmishes broke out in the Sunda Strait, where English ships tried to intercept Dutch convoys. One report described cannon fire so close that the sea itself leaped like boiling water. Though casualties were small compared to Europe's great wars, the symbolism mattered. To English merchants, every ship lost was another proof that the Dutch sought monopoly at all costs. To the Dutch, every English intrusion threatened the empire of profit they had built with blood and gunpowder. Back in London, Parliament was too consumed by civil war to intervene decisively, but pamphlets railed against Dutch arrogance. In Amsterdam, VOC directors calculated profits and ordered stricter patrols. Neither side sought a formal war in 1644, yet both sharpened their knives. Within 2 decades, this simmering rivalry would erupt into full-scale Anglo-Dutch wars, battles that would decide the control of the seas. For the sailors who fought in 1644, these skirmishes were personal. Survivors recalled grappling in the dark, boarding parties clashing hand-to-hand, and prisoners thrown into tropical waters. The trade in nutmeg and cloves left more than a taste in Europe's kitchens. It left blood on the waves of Asia. The year's encounters were part of a wider story. While kings fought for crowns in Europe, companies fought for monopolies abroad. Private profit and national pride blurred, creating wars without declarations, battles without frontiers. In the waters around Ambon and Java, 1644 was another year in which empires were built not by treaties, but by cannon fire on the open sea. As rebels and Manchu banners fought for Beijing, another group of outsiders watched China's turmoil with anxious eyes. The Jesuits, long present at the Ming court, had built their influence not through armies but through knowledge. They brought with them astronomy, mathematics, and cartography, tools that impressed scholars and emperors alike. When the Ming fell in 1644 and the Qing rose, the missionaries faced a choice as grave as any general on the battlefield: retreat or adapt. Among them was Adam Schall von Bell, a German Jesuit who had arrived in China years earlier. Gifted in astronomy, Schall had earned the respect of Ming officials by predicting eclipses more accurately than Chinese scholars. When the Manchu conquered Beijing, he offered his service to the new regime. It was a bold move. Aligning with the Qing could make him a traitor in Ming loyalist eyes, yet retreating would mean losing decades of labor. The Qing accepted him. They understood the power of knowledge as much as the power of steel. Shall helped them reform the imperial calendar, a task of immense significance in China, where the accuracy of the calendar symbolized the harmony between heaven and ruler. He introduced European instruments, refined astronomical tables, and guided the court in aligning their rituals with the stars. Heaven's patterns teach us the order of men, he once wrote, reflecting his belief that science could bridge empires. At the same time, Jesuits contributed to mapping the empire. Their skills in geometry and surveying allowed them to draw charts that surpassed traditional methods. For the Qing, who now sought to legitimize their rule, these maps were not only tools of governance but symbols of mastery over a vast land. Not all Chinese officials welcomed the foreigners. Some whispered that the Jesuits served as spies for Europe. Others resented their influence at court. Yet their usefulness was undeniable. In 1644, amid the chaos of dynastic collapse, the Jesuits secured a foothold that would grow stronger in the decades ahead. Their story shows another side of 1644. While emperors hanged themselves and generals betrayed dynasties, quiet negotiations of knowledge unfolded in palace observatories. The fate of science and empire intertwined. In a world of swords and banners, it was the telescope and the compass that also shaped destiny. While Jesuit scholars in Beijing secured their place by reading the stars, their brothers in Africa met a very different fate. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the dream of bringing the ancient Christian kingdom into the Catholic fold ended in 1644 with exile, silence, and closed doors for decades. Jesuits had labored to win over Ethiopia's rulers. They had come with promises of union, claiming that the Pope of Rome could bind Ethiopia's church to the wider Christian world. At first they gained influence, baptizing nobles and even persuading Emperor Susenyos to accept Rome's authority. But the experiment brought unrest. Ordinary Ethiopians, deeply attached to their own Orthodox faith, resisted fiercely. Rebellions erupted, priests and villagers alike rejecting foreign rites. When Susenyos abdicated in 1632, his son Fasilides restored orthodoxy and expelled the Jesuits. Yet some missionaries lingered, hoping to return to favor. By 1644, that hope was extinguished. Fasilides ordered the final expulsion of Jesuits from the empire. Their churches were closed, their converts forced to return to the Ethiopian rite, and their foreign teachers marched out under guard. A Jesuit account recorded the bitterness. The mountain kingdom has shut its gates, and the faith we planted is torn up by the roots. For Ethiopia, it was a reassertion of independence. In a century when European empires pushed into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, here was a kingdom that resisted and preserved its own religious identity. The collapse of the missions had broader meaning. It showed the limits of European expansion, the places where gunpowder and persuasion could not prevail. For Ethiopia's people, it was a victory for tradition, for the survival of an ancient church older than Rome itself. In 1644, as Jesuits gained favor in Beijing, they were cast out of Gondar. Two ends of a continent, two opposite fates. Knowledge opened one gate, resistance closed another. History seldom moves in a single line. It bends and twists, carrying triumph in one land and defeat in another. Before we close, let me leave you with a question, a small test of memory and curiosity. In 1644, one remarkable event took place but has not been mentioned in our series so far. Which of the following do you think it was? A volcanic haze in Iceland dimmed the skies over northern Europe. B, the playwright Pedro Calderón de la Barca staged one of his last great dramas in Madrid. The Russian Cossacks pressed deeper into Siberia, mapping the frozen rivers of Yakutia. Only one is correct. Write your answer in the comments, and in the next episode we will reveal the truth. Now let us look back at what this chapter has shown. The year 1644 was not only a year of fallen dynasties and civil wars, but also a year in which the struggle for empire and the battle for souls spanned the globe. In the Mediterranean, the Knights of Malta attacked an Ottoman convoy, killing pilgrims and seizing treasure. That single act lit the fuse of the Cretan War, a struggle that would last for nearly a quarter of a century. In Brazil, Johan Maurits was recalled, His enlightened experiment in tolerance and science abandoned to the calculations of profit, leaving the colony to slide into revolt. On the coast of Angola, the port of Luanda witnessed the forced departure of thousands of enslaved Africans, their bodies chained, their lives uprooted to feed the hunger of sugar in the New World. At the same time, Spain's empire, once the richest on earth, faltered as silver shipments collapsed, leaving coffers empty and riots in the streets of Andalusia. In Goa, settlers turned against Jesuits who seemed to weigh heavier than the crown itself. While further east, Dutch and English ships exchanged fire in the waters of Java and Ambon. Jesuits in China found favor at the new Qing court, mapping stars and empire alike. While in Ethiopia, their brothers were expelled, their churches closed, their mission ended. This episode revealed the parallel threads that bound the year together. Empires clashed for seas and spices, merchants fought for profit, missionaries battled for influence, and enslaved men and women were carried across the Atlantic against their will. The story of 1644 is not only about generals and kings. It is about ports, plantations, maps, and ships that stitched the world together in both glory and suffering. And here lies the meaning. Dynasties may fall in palaces, but in 1644, the pulse of history also beat in the holds of slave ships, in the halls of trading companies, and in the arguments of missionaries at faraway courts. The collapse of silver in Spain echoed in empty markets. The recall of Johan Maurits echoed in rebellion in Brazil. The Jesuits expelled in Ethiopia echoed the survival of an ancient faith. The Jesuits welcomed in Beijing echoed the hunger of a new dynasty for legitimacy. Let us imagine for a moment the parallel lines of history. What if the Knights of Malta had not struck that convoy? Would Crete have avoided 24 years of war? What if Johan Maurits had remained in Recife? Could Brazil have become a model of tolerance centuries before the Enlightenment? What if Spain's silver mines had not faltered? Would Madrid have kept its grip on empire longer, changing the balance of Europe? History offers no answers, only questions that sharpen our view of what was and what might have been. As we close this chapter, I invite you to share your thoughts. Which of these events speaks to you most? The violence of Malta's raid, the tragedy of Luanda's slave port, the vision of Johan Maurits, or the quiet diplomacy of Jesuits beneath the stars of China? Leave your reflections in the comments so history does not rest only in books but in living voices. In our next episode, the lens shifts once more. We will explore 1644 through science, invention, and culture. We will meet astronomers mapping the heavens, philosophers debating freedom, and artists capturing a world in flux. We will uncover how even in an age of war and famine, human creativity did not fade but shone all the brighter. Like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and if you wish to help keep these stories alive, consider a small donation. History is not past, and it is a mirror held to our present. Together, let us keep that mirror polished.